The cold wind swept through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Colorado, carrying with it the scent of desperation and the distant promise of snow. It was the kind of day that made a man question every decision that had led him to this God-forsaken corner of the world. But Colton Hayes had stopped questioning his decisions years ago. He simply lived with them, each one settling into his bones like the ache of an old wound. He stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered outside the general store, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the men behind him. At 34 years old, Colton was what the people of Silver Creek called a quiet giant. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with hands large enough to span a dinner plate and arms thick as fence posts, he was the kind of man other men stepped aside for. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a certain instinctual respect for something wild that seemed barely contained beneath his weathered skin. His face told a story of hardship. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a night he tried to forget. His dark hair, streaked with premature grey at the temples, fell past his collar in waves that he rarely bothered to tame. His eyes were the colour of storm clouds, grey and deep, and holding secrets that he shared with no one. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory, 3,000 acres of rolling hills and mountain valleys, with a house big enough for a family he had never managed to have. His wife, Sarah, had died in childbirth 7 years ago, taking their daughter with her. Since then, the house had felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, filled with ghosts he could not escape. Colton had not come to town for the spectacle that was unfolding before him. He had come for supplies, nothing more: flour, coffee, nails for the fence that needed mending. Simple things for a simple existence. But the crowd had drawn his attention, and what he saw when he pushed his way to the front made his stomach turn. A wooden platform had been erected in front of the general store, the kind usually reserved for political speeches or the announcement of new territory laws. But today, it held something far more disturbing. 3 young women stood on that platform, their wrists bound in front of them, their faces pale with terror. "Step right up, gentlemen," called a voice that made Colton's jaw clench. Silas Murdoch, the town's most notorious debt collector, stood beside the women with a ledger in his hand and a smile on his face that belonged on a rattlesnake. These fine young ladies find themselves in unfortunate circumstances. Their families owed debts they could not pay. The law says these debts must be settled, and settle them we shall. A murmur went through the crowd. Some men shuffled uncomfortably. Others leaned forward with interest that made Colton's blood run cold. "We will start with this one," Silas continued, grabbing the arm of the first woman. She was perhaps 25, with brown hair and tired eyes. Martha Collins. Strong back, good teeth. Knows how to cook and clean. Her father owed $47. Who will start the bidding? The auction began, and Colton watched with growing disgust as Martha was sold to a farmer from the next county for $53. The man led her away like livestock, and she went without resistance, her spirit clearly broken long before this day. The second woman, a widow of about 30, went for $38 to a man who owned the sawmill on the outskirts of town. She kept her chin high as she was led away, but Colton could see her hands trembling. Then Silas turned to the third woman, and everything in Colton went still. She was young, too young for this. Perhaps 19, maybe 20 at most. Her hair was the color of copper in autumn, falling in tangled waves around a face that was heart-shaped and pale as porcelain. Her eyes, even from this distance, were striking. Green as spring grass, bright with unshed tears, and something that looked remarkably like defiance. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with a frame so delicate she looked like a strong wind might carry her away. Her dress was worn and patched in several places, the hem muddied from travel, but she held herself with a dignity that seemed entirely at odds with her circumstances. And finally, Silas announced, his smile widening. "We have the finest specimen of the day. Miss Clara Bishop, 19 years of age, fresh from the East. Her father, God rest his worthless soul, left this world owing $3.47 to the general store. Just $3. A pittance, really." A ripple of dark laughter went through the crowd. $3. The girl was being sold for $3. "Now, Miss Bishop, here is something special," Silas continued, circling her like a vulture. "Untouched, if you understand my meaning. Pure as mountain snow. Educated too. Can read and write, though I cannot imagine what use that will be to whoever purchases her. She will make someone a fine wife, or at the very least, a fine worker." Clara Bishop kept her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, refusing to look at the crowd that ogled her. Her chin was raised, her jaw set, and despite the tears that trembled on her lashes, she did not let them fall. "Who will start the bidding?" Silas called. "Remember, gentlemen, $3 is the minimum. Her father's debt must be paid." $3, called a voice from the back. Colton recognized it as belonging to Buck Wheeler, a ranch hand known for his cruelty and his whiskey. $3, Silas repeated. "Do I hear $3.50? $4, another voice called. This one belonged to Pete Morrison, the owner of the saloon. His interest in the girl made Colton's hands curl into fists. $5, Buck Wheeler countered, pushing his way forward. His eyes were fixed on Clara with an intensity that made several women in the crowd turn away in disgust. "Now we have a bidding war," Silas exclaimed with evident delight. $5 from Mr. Wheeler. "Do I hear $6? $10, Pete Morrison called, crossing his arms over his chest. The crowd murmured. $10 was a significant sum for a debt of $3. Clara's composure finally cracked. Her lower lip trembled, and a single tear escaped, tracing a silver path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with her bound hands, but Colton had seen it. He had seen the terror behind her defiance, the desperate hope that somehow someone decent would step forward. $15, Buck Wheeler shouted, his face flushed with determination. 20, Pete Morrison countered. The two men glared at each other, and Clara looked between them like a rabbit caught between two wolves. Neither option held anything but suffering for her. Colton knew Buck Wheeler's reputation with women. He knew what happened behind closed doors at Pete Morrison's saloon. $25, Buck Wheeler said, his voice carrying a warning. Pete Morrison hesitated. $25 was more than he wanted to spend. He shook his head and stepped back. "Going once?" Silas called, his gavel raised. "Going twice?" Something broke inside Colton Hayes. Something that had been dormant for 7 years, buried under grief and guilt and the weight of too many lonely nights. He did not think. He simply acted. $3, he said, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade through butter. Everyone turned to stare at him. Buck Wheeler's face twisted with confusion and anger. "I beg your pardon?" Silas said, lowering his gavel. $3, Colton repeated, stepping forward until he stood directly in front of the platform. "That is the debt, is it not? $3.47. I will pay the debt. Nothing more, nothing less. The girl is not for sale. She is paying off what her father owed. I am paying that debt for her." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Even Clara looked at him now, her green eyes wide with shock. "Now see here," Silas sputtered. "That is not how this works. The bid stands at $25. "The bid is illegal," Colton said calmly, though his eyes held a dangerous glint. "You are not selling goods, Silas. You are selling a human being. The law says debts must be settled. It does not say anything about auctioning people to the highest bidder. $3.47 is what is owed. That is what I am paying." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 worn dollar bills and a handful of coins. He counted out exactly $3.47 and held it out to Silas. "This is the debt. Consider it paid." Silas's face went purple with rage, but he looked at Colton, really looked at him, at his size and his reputation and the barely controlled fury in his storm-grey eyes, and whatever protest he had been forming died on his lips. "Fine," he spat, snatching the money from Colton's hand. "The debt is paid. The girl is yours." He cut the ropes binding Clara's wrists with a vicious slash of his knife, then pushed her off the platform. She stumbled, and Colton caught her before she could fall, his large hands closing around her upper arms with surprising gentleness. "Easy," he murmured, steadying her. "I have got you." Clara looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face for some indication of his intentions. She was trembling, whether from cold or fear or some combination of both. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Colton did not answer. He simply released her arms and shrugged off his coat, a heavy thing lined with sheepskin that had cost him more than $3 many times over. He draped it over her shoulders, engulfing her in warmth. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though she swayed slightly on her feet. "Come on, then," he said, placing a hand at the small of her back. "Let us get you out of here." He guided her through the crowd, which parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. Buck Wheeler stepped into his path, his face twisted with fury. "You think you can just swoop in and take what is mine, Hayes?" Colton stopped walking, but did not remove his hand from Clara's back. He could feel her trembling against his palm. "She was never yours, Wheeler. She does not belong to anyone. Now step aside." "Or what?" Colton smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who had seen too much darkness to be afraid of anything a fool like Buck Wheeler could throw at him. "Or I will make you step aside? Your choice." For a long moment the two men stared at each other. Then Buck Wheeler spat on the ground and moved out of the way, muttering curses under his breath. Colton guided Clara to his wagon, which was parked near the livery stable. He helped her up onto the seat, his hands lingering on her waist, just long enough to ensure she was steady, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. They rode in silence through the streets of Silver Creek, past the saloon and the church and the little schoolhouse that stood empty because there were not enough children in town to warrant a teacher. Clara kept her eyes fixed on her hands, which were folded in her lap, the angry red marks from the ropes still visible on her wrists. It was only when they had left the town behind, when the road stretched out before them, through a landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains, that she finally spoke. "You did not buy me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You paid off my father's debt." "That is correct," Colton replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "What does that mean? What do you expect from me?" He glanced at her, his grey eyes unreadable. "It means you are free, Miss Bishop. The debt is paid. You owe nothing to anyone." "But you paid it. Does that not mean I owe you?" Colton was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Then he shook his head. "I did not pay that money to buy your gratitude or your servitude. I paid it because what they were doing was wrong, and I could not stand by and watch it happen." Clara stared at him, trying to reconcile his words with everything she knew about men and the world. She had been taught, since she was old enough to understand such things, that men did not do anything without expecting something in return. Her own father had been proof enough of that. He had gambled away her mother's inheritance, had sold their home piece by piece to pay his debts, and in the end had died in a drunken stupor, leaving her with nothing but his name and his failures. "I do not understand," she admitted. "What is there to understand?" "You are taking me somewhere." "To your home, I assume. What will happen when we get there?" Colton sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I suppose I had not thought that far ahead. When I saw you standing on that platform, saw what they were about to do, I just acted. I did not make a plan." "So you have no idea what to do with me?" "I did not say that." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have a ranch. It is a big place, too big for one person, really. There is plenty of room. You can stay there until you figure out what you want to do, where you want to go. You will be safe there. That much I can promise you." Clara wrapped his coat tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the scent of leather and wood smoke and something else, something warm and masculine that she could not quite identify. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. "I do not know you. For all I know, you could be worse than the men you saved me from." Colton considered this for a long moment. Then he pulled on the reins, bringing the wagon to a stop in the middle of the road. He turned to face her, his grey eyes meeting her green ones with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You have no reason to trust me," he said quietly. "None at all. We are strangers, and the world has taught you that strangers cannot be trusted. But I am going to tell you something, Miss Bishop, and I want you to listen carefully." Clara nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I have done many things in my life that I am not proud of. I have hurt people, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. I have failed the people who mattered most to me. I am not a good man, not in the way that the word is usually meant. But there is one thing I have never done and will never do. I have never harmed a woman. I have never forced myself on anyone. The very thought of it makes me sick to my stomach. So whatever else you might think of me, whatever else you might fear, please do not fear that, because it will never happen." He held her gaze as he spoke, never looking away, never blinking, and something in his eyes, something raw and honest, and almost painful in its sincerity, made Clara believe him. "All right," she said softly. "I believe you." Something shifted in Colton's expression. Relief, perhaps. Or maybe just the release of a tension he had not realized he was holding. "Good," he said, turning back to the road and flicking the reins. "Now let us get home before this cold gets any worse." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Less wary, more comfortable. Clara found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, this strange man who had paid $3 to set her free. He was not handsome, not in any conventional sense. His face was too rough, too weathered, too marked by the scar that traced a pale line from his temple to his jaw. But there was something compelling about him nonetheless. A quiet strength that seemed to radiate from every pore. A steadiness that made her feel, despite everything, oddly safe. The sun was beginning to set when the ranch came into view. Clara's breath caught in her throat at the sight of it. The house was massive, a two-story structure built of logs and stone with windows that glowed golden in the fading light. Smoke rose from two separate chimneys, promising warmth inside. Beyond the house, she could see barns and outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. "This is your home?" she asked, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "It is," Colton replied. "Welcome to Hawk Ridge Ranch." He pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down, then came around to help Clara. His hands encircled her waist, lifting her down as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. For a moment they stood there, closer than they had been before, close enough that Clara could see the individual streaks of silver in his dark hair, could smell the soap he had used that morning beneath the scent of leather and horse. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then stepped back, putting distance between them. "Come inside. Mrs. Holloway, my housekeeper, will have supper ready, and I am sure she can find you something more suitable to wear." The door opened before they reached it, and a round, cheerful-looking woman in her 50s appeared on the threshold. Her grey hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her apron was dusted with flour. Her eyes went wide when she saw Clara, but she recovered quickly, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I was not expecting guests." "Neither was I," Colton admitted. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Miss Clara Bishop. She will be staying with us for a while." Mrs. Holloway's eyes flickered between them, clearly curious but too well trained to ask questions. Of course. Come in, dear, come in. You look half frozen. Let me get you something warm to drink." Now Clara allowed herself to be ushered inside, and the warmth of the house enveloped her like a blanket. The main room was large and comfortable, with heavy furniture arranged around a stone fireplace that crackled with a cheerful fire. Animal heads mounted on the walls stared down at her with glass eyes, and thick rugs covered the wooden floor. "I will show you to a room," Mrs. Holloway said, taking Clara's arm. "Mr. Hayes, supper will be ready in an hour." Colton nodded, already shrugging off his hat and hanging it on a hook by the door. "I need to check on the horses. I will be back." He disappeared out the front door, leaving Clara alone with the housekeeper. Mrs. Holloway led her up a curved staircase to the second floor, down a long hallway, and into a room that took Clara's breath away. It was beautiful. A large bed dominated the space, covered in a quilt of rich blues and greens. A writing desk stood by the window, which overlooked the mountains. A wardrobe, a washstand, and a small fireplace completed the furnishings. Everything was clean and well maintained, but there was a layer of dust on the surfaces that suggested the room had not been used in some time. "This was meant to be a guest room," Mrs. Holloway explained, "but we do not get many guests these days. Let me fetch some fresh linens and get this fire going, and I will see about finding you some clothes. You look about the same size as my daughter. She left some things behind when she got married last year." "Thank you," Clara said, and meant it. "You are very kind." Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "Mr. Hayes is a good man, whatever folks might say about him. You are safe here, dear. Whatever brought you to his wagon, whatever your circumstances, you are safe." She bustled away to gather supplies, leaving Clara alone in the beautiful room. Clara moved to the window and looked out at the landscape below. The sun had set completely now, and the world was painted in shades of blue and purple. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than she had ever seen in the city. She thought about the events of the day, about how quickly her life had changed. This morning, she had been a prisoner, destined to be sold to the highest bidder. Now she stood in a room that was more comfortable than any she had ever occupied, in the home of a stranger who had paid $3 to set her free. Why had he done it? The question nagged at her. Men like Colton Hayes did not exist in her experience. Men did not rescue women without expecting something in return. There had to be a catch, had to be something she was missing. But as she stood there, watching the stars emerge one by one, she found that she did not care. For the first time in months, she was warm, she was safe, and tomorrow, whatever it might bring, was a problem for another day. Supper that night was a quiet affair. Colton and Clara sat across from each other at a table large enough to seat 12, eating the hearty stew that Mrs. Holloway had prepared. The housekeeper had found Clara a dress of soft blue wool that fit her better than anything she had owned in years, and had helped her brush out her tangled hair until it fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Colton tried not to stare, but it was difficult. In clean clothes, with her hair brushed and her face washed, Clara Bishop was beautiful. Not in the painted, artificial way of the women who worked at the saloon, but in a natural, unaffected way that made his chest ache with something he had not felt in years. "This stew is wonderful," Clara said, breaking the silence. "Mrs. Holloway is an excellent cook," Colton agreed. "It is one of the many reasons I cannot afford to lose her." A smile tugged at the corner of Clara's lips. "How long has she worked for you?" "Going on 15 years now. She came with her husband Thomas after my wife died. Thomas is my ranch foreman. They have been like family to me." Clara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Your wife?" Colton nodded, his expression clouding. "Sarah. She passed 7 years ago. Childbirth." "I am sorry," Clara said softly. "Thank you." They ate in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind outside. "What happened to the baby?" Clara asked, then immediately wished she had not. "I'm sorry, that was too personal. You do not have to answer." "It is all right." Colton set down his spoon, his appetite suddenly gone. "She did not survive either, a girl. We were going to name her Rose after Sarah's mother." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. She had known this man for only a few hours, but the pain in his voice was so raw, so palpable, that she felt it as keenly as if it were her own. "That is a beautiful name," she said. Colton looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment the mask he wore slipped. She saw the grief behind his eyes, the loneliness, the years of carrying a burden that had never gotten lighter. "It is," he agreed. It was. He pushed back from the table, suddenly needing to move. "There are some things I need to attend to in the barn. Please, make yourself at home. Mrs. Holloway will show you anything you need." Before Clara could respond, he was gone, the front door closing behind him with a quiet click. Mrs. Holloway appeared a moment later to clear the dishes. She looked at the door, then at Clara, and shook her head. "He has not talked about Sarah and the baby in years," she said quietly. "Not to anyone." "Why did he tell me?" The housekeeper studied her for a long moment, her eyes thoughtful. "I do not know, dear, but I think it means something. Something good." Clara helped Mrs. Holloway clean up, partly because it felt wrong to sit idle while someone else worked, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands. The older woman chatted amiably about the ranch, about the upcoming winter, about the town and its residents. She did not ask how Clara had come to be in Colton's wagon, and Clara was grateful for her discretion. Later, alone in her room, Clara lay in the comfortable bed and stared at the ceiling. The fire had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had died down, and the world was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old house settling. She thought about Colton Hayes, about the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his wife and daughter. She thought about the way he had stepped forward to save her, asking nothing in return. She thought about the warmth of his coat around her shoulders, the steadiness of his hands as he helped her down from the wagon. He was a mystery, this man, a contradiction wrapped in an enigma, rough and gentle, strong and wounded, a giant with the heart of something fragile. As she drifted off to sleep, Clara found herself wondering what tomorrow would bring. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid to find out. The days that followed settled into a routine. Clara woke each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of bacon frying. She ate breakfast with Colton and Mrs. Holloway, then spent the morning helping with whatever tasks needed doing. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, mending. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and Clara found satisfaction in it. The ranch itself was a world unto itself. Clara spent her first days exploring, marveling at the vastness of it all. The main house was grander than anything she had ever lived in, with rooms she had not yet discovered, and corners that seemed to hold secrets from years past. There was a parlor with a piano that no one played anymore, its keys yellowed with age. There was a library filled with books that smelled of leather and dust. There was a sewing room with a window that overlooked the mountains, where the light was perfect in the afternoon. Mrs. Holloway showed her everything, chattering all the while about the history of the place. The house had been built by Colton's grandfather, she explained, who had come west with nothing but a dream and a strong back. He had married a woman from Boston, a society girl who had scandalized her family by running off with a rancher. Together, they had built something lasting, something that had survived droughts and floods and the Civil War and everything else the world had thrown at it. "Mr. Hayes carries on their legacy," Mrs. Holloway said, her voice soft with affection. He does not see it, of course. He only sees the weight of it, the responsibility. But the rest of us see the truth. This place, this ranch, it is alive because of him. Because he refuses to let it die. Clara thought about those words often in the days that followed. She watched Colton work, saw the way he cared for every animal, every blade of grass, every person under his protection. He was not the cold, distant man she had first taken him for. He was something far more complex, a man who felt deeply but showed it rarely, a man who had built walls around his heart but still let kindness leak through the cracks. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Clara was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she heard raised voices from the barn. She set down her basket and hurried toward the sound, her heart pounding with sudden fear. Inside the barn, she found Colton standing over one of the ranch hands, a young man named Billy who could not have been more than 17. Billy was on the ground, his face pale and twisted with pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "What happened?" Clara asked, rushing forward. "Horse spooked," Colton said, his voice tight. "Threw him into the stall door." Billy groaned, tears streaming down his face. "I am sorry, Mr. Hayes. I did not mean to let him get away from me." "Hush!" Colton said, his voice gentler than Clara had ever heard it. "It was not your fault. Horses spook. It happens." He looked up at one of the other hands. "Ride to town and fetch the doctor. Tell him it is urgent." The man nodded and ran for his horse. Colton knelt beside Billy, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the boy's leg. "We need to set this before it swells anymore. Clara, can you hold his shoulders? This is going to hurt." Clara did as she was told, kneeling behind Billy and gripping his shoulders firmly. She murmured soothing words as Colton worked, his face a mask of concentration. When he finally straightened the bone with a sickening crack, Billy screamed and then went limp, unconscious from the pain. "Is he going to be all right?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "He will be," Colton said, wiping sweat from his brow. "The break is clean. The doctor will splint it properly, but I think he will heal well." He looked at her, something new in his eyes. "Thank you for helping." "Of course." They carried Billy to the bunkhouse together, and Clara stayed with him until the doctor arrived. By the time she left, the sun was setting, and her hands were still trembling from the adrenaline. She found Colton on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair and staring out at the mountains. He did not look up when she approached, but he shifted slightly, making room for her to sit beside him. "You were very gentle with him," Clara said. "With Billy?" Colton shrugged. "He is just a boy, barely old enough to shave. His mother sent him to me because she could not afford to feed him any more. The least I can do is make sure he survives long enough to become a man." Clara studied his profile in the fading light. "You care about all of them, do you not? All the men who work for you. They are my responsibility, just like the cattle, just like the land, just like everything else on this ranch." "It is more than that." He turned to look at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you care about them as people, not just as workers. You know their names, their families, their stories. You treat them with dignity and respect. That is not just responsibility, Mr. Hayes. That is something else entirely." Colton was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I have seen what happens when men are treated as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. My grandfather treated his workers like that, and it nearly destroyed everything he built. When I took over this ranch, I swore I would do things differently. I swore that every person under my care would be valued, would be protected, would be given the chance to thrive." He paused. "I do not always succeed, but I try." Clara reached out and placed her hand over his, surprising both of them. "I think you succeed more than you know." He looked at their joined hands, then at her face, and something shifted in the air between them. something electric and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes?" But whatever he had been about to say was lost as Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, calling them in for supper. The moment broke, and they pulled apart, both of them suddenly aware of how close they had been. They did not speak of it again that night, but something had changed between them, something fundamental and irreversible. And as Clara lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl outside her window, she found herself thinking not of the life she had left behind, but of the life that might be waiting for her here. Colton was gone most of the day, out on the range with his men, checking on the cattle, mending fences, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch of this size running. But he was always there for supper, and slowly, conversation became easier between them. He learned that she had grown up in Philadelphia, the only child of parents who had loved each other, but not very well. Her mother had died when she was 12, and her father had never recovered. He had turned to gambling and drink, squandering what little they had until there was nothing left. When he died, Clara had sold everything she could and used the money to travel west, hoping to start over in a place where no one knew her name or her shame. She learned that he had been born on this very ranch, the son of a rancher who had carved this empire out of the wilderness with nothing but his bare hands and sheer determination. He had inherited it all when his father died, along with the responsibility of keeping it going. His marriage to Sarah had been arranged by their fathers, but they had come to love each other genuinely and deeply. Her death had nearly destroyed him. The years since had been about survival, not living. "Do you ever think about marrying again?" Clara asked one evening, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Colton looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, his grey eyes unreadable. "I used to think I would not. That Sarah was it for me, and there would never be anyone else." "Used to?" He set down his cup, his gaze holding hers. "Things change." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away, suddenly very interested in the pattern of the tablecloth. Something had been building between them over the past 2 weeks, something neither of them had acknowledged but both of them felt, a tension that crackled in the air whenever they were in the same room, a pull that drew them together like magnets, despite their best efforts to resist. That night Clara could not sleep. She lay awake for hours, tossing and turning, her mind full of thoughts she could not quiet. Finally she gave up and climbed out of bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and padding downstairs in her bare feet. The house was dark and quiet, but a light was burning in Colton's study. The door was slightly ajar, and Clara hesitated outside it, not wanting to intrude, but unable to walk away. "You can come in," Colton's voice called softly. Clara pushed open the door and stepped inside. The study was small and cozy, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. Colton sat in a leather chair by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the flames. "I could not sleep," she said. "Neither could I." She moved closer, drawn by something she could not name. "What are you thinking about?" He looked up at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her breath catch. "You," he said simply. "I am thinking about you." Clara's heart began to pound. "What about me?" "Everything." He set down his glass and rose to his feet, closing the distance between them until they stood mere inches apart. "The way you laugh when Mrs. Holloway tells her stories. The way you bite your lip when you are concentrating on a task. The way the firelight catches your hair and turns it to copper. I think about all of it, all the time, and I cannot make it stop." Clara trembled, but not from cold. "Colton." "Therese, I know I should not feel this way," he continued, his voice low and rough. "You are young. You have your whole life ahead of you. You deserve better than a scarred, broken man twice your age who has nothing to offer but a house full of ghosts." "That is not true," Clara whispered. "Is it not?" She reached up, her hand trembling, and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his scar, the rough stubble of his jaw, the corner of his mouth. He closed his eyes at her touch, a shudder running through his massive frame. "You saved me," she said. "You paid $3 to save my life, and you have asked nothing in return. You have given me a home, safety, kindness. You have given me more than anyone ever has. How can you say you have nothing to offer?" Colton opened his eyes, and she saw the war being waged within them. The desire battling with doubt, the hope fighting against fear. "Clara," he said, and her name on his lips was like a prayer. "I am trying to do the right thing. I am trying to be honorable, but you make it very difficult." "Then stop trying." She rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, the first meeting of two souls who had been alone for too long. But then something ignited between them, and gentleness gave way to something more. Colton's arms came around her, pulling her against his chest, and Clara felt herself melting into him, into his warmth and his strength and the steady beat of his heart. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I should not have done that," Clara whispered, though she made no move to step away. "Do you regret it?" She looked up at him, at his storm-grey eyes and his scarred face, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "No," she said, "I do not regret anything." Colton smiled, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and chasing away the shadows. "Neither do I." He kissed her again, softer this time, sweeter, and Clara felt something bloom in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or maybe something more. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. She and Colton did not speak of what was growing between them, not in words, but it was there nonetheless. In the way he looked at her across the breakfast table, in the way she found excuses to be near him whenever she could. In the stolen kisses in the hallway, the gentle touches when they thought no one was watching. Mrs. Holloway noticed, of course. Not much escaped her sharp eyes, but she said nothing, only smiled knowingly and went about her business with a satisfied air. Then the letter came. It arrived on a cold morning in late November, delivered by a rider from town. Clara was helping Mrs. Holloway in the kitchen when Colton walked in, his face pale and his jaw tight. "What is wrong?" Clara asked, fear gripping her heart. He held out the letter. "It is from a lawyer in Philadelphia. It seems your father's debts were more extensive than anyone knew. There is a man coming to collect what is owed. He will be here within the week." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "How much?" Colton hesitated, then said quietly, $500. $500. It might as well have been 5 million. Clara sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Who is this man?" she asked. "His name is Victor Crane. According to the lawyer, he bought up your father's debts and has been looking for you ever since." "Victor Crane," Clara repeated, and the name tasted like poison on her tongue. She knew that name, had heard her father speak it in terrified whispers in the weeks before his death. Victor Crane was a wealthy businessman from Philadelphia, known for his ruthlessness and his complete lack of scruples. "He wants more than the money," Clara said dully. "He wants me." Colton's eyes darkened. "What do you mean?" Clara looked up at him, shame and fear warring in her expression. "My father tried to use me to pay his debts. He offered me to Victor Crane as a bride. I refused. I ran away in the middle of the night and used the last of my money to come west. I thought I had escaped him. I thought—" She could not finish the sentence. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, streaming down her cheeks. Colton crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Look at me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Clara, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, expecting to see disgust or disappointment. Instead, she saw something that looked remarkably like determination. "I do not care about Victor Crane," he said. "I do not care about your father's debts. I do not care about any of it. You are here now. You are safe here, and I will do whatever it takes to keep it that way." $500, Colton. That is a fortune. "I have the money." Clara shook her head. "I will not let you pay my debts. You have already done so much." "Then let me do more." He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Marry me," he said. Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Marry me, Clara. Let me protect you. Let me give you my name, my home, my life. Let me be your husband, not because I paid $3 at an auction, but because I love you, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "You love me. I think I have loved you from the moment I saw you standing on that platform, refusing to bow to men who wanted to break you. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. And I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of you, if you will let me." Clara could not speak. The tears were flowing freely now, but they were no longer tears of fear or shame. They were tears of joy, of overwhelming, impossible joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Colton let out a breath he seemed to have been holding forever. Then he swept her into his arms and kissed her deeply and thoroughly, and Clara felt something shift in her soul, a door closing on the past, a window opening to the future. They were married 3 days later, in a small ceremony at the ranch. Mrs. Holloway stood as witness, tears streaming down her face as she watched the man she had helped raise pledge his life to the woman who had so clearly healed his heart. Thomas Holloway performed the ceremony, having been ordained many years ago by a traveling preacher. The weather was cold but clear, and the mountains in the distance were capped with snow. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Holloway had produced from some mysterious trunk in the attic. It had belonged to Colton's mother, the housekeeper explained, and had been waiting all these years for someone worthy to wear it. Colton wore his best suit, a dark blue affair that made his grey eyes look almost silver. His hair was combed, his boots were polished, and there was a light in his eyes that Mrs. Holloway said she had not seen since before Sarah died. When they exchanged their vows, their voices were steady and sure. When Colton slipped the ring onto Clara's finger, a simple gold band that had been his grandmother's, his hands did not tremble. When he kissed his bride, the kiss was gentle and reverent and full of promise. "I will love you until my dying breath," he whispered against her lips, "and beyond, if such a thing is possible." "I will hold you to that," Clara whispered back. Victor Crane arrived 4 days after the wedding. He came in a fancy carriage, pulled by matched black horses, with 2 hired men riding alongside. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, with a face like a hatchet and eyes like chips of ice. He wore an expensive suit and carried an ebony walking stick, topped with a silver handle shaped like a snake. Colton met him at the gate with Thomas and 3 of his best men at his back. Clara watched from the window of the house, her heart pounding with fear. "Mr. Hayes, I presume," Victor Crane said, stepping down from his carriage with an air of supreme confidence. "I am here for what belongs to me." "And what might that be?" "The girl, Clara Bishop, or should I say Clara Hayes now, according to the records I acquired in town. A hasty wedding, was it not? Almost as if someone was trying to hide something." Colton's expression did not change. "Miss Bishop is now my wife. She belongs to no one but herself." "Ah, but you see, that is where you are mistaken." Victor Crane pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "I hold debts owed by her father totaling $537.62. The law says these debts must be paid. Until they are, Clara Bishop or Hayes, or whatever she chooses to call herself, is bound to me. Show me these debts." Crane handed over the papers with a smile that made Clara's skin crawl. Colton examined them carefully, his face revealing nothing. "These appear to be in order," he admitted finally. "What do you want?" "What I have always wanted. The girl, of course. As my wife. She is already married. Marriages can be annulled, especially those contracted under such questionable circumstances. A 19-year-old bride purchased at auction for $3. I am sure a judge would find that most irregular. I did not purchase her. I paid her father's debt. A technicality, the result is the same." Crane's cold eyes swept toward the house, and Clara instinctively stepped back from the window. "Give her to me, Mr. Hayes. Pay the debts and give her to me, and this can all be over." Colton was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost pleasant, but there was steel beneath the surface. "I have a counter-proposal, Mr. Crane." "I'm listening." "I will pay the $537. I will pay an additional $200 for your trouble in traveling all this way. In return, you will sign over those debts to me and leave my property immediately. You will never contact my wife again. You will never speak her name again. You will forget she exists." Crane's smile widened. "And if I refuse?" Colton smiled back, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Then I will kill you. Right here, right now, in front of these witnesses. I will claim you threatened my wife and my home, and every man here will testify to that effect. You will be buried in an unmarked grave on my land, and no one in the territory will care enough to investigate." The smile slowly faded from Crane's face. He looked at Colton, really looked at him, at the massive frame and the scarred face and the cold determination in his storm-grey eyes. He looked at the men standing behind him, their hands resting casually on their weapons. He looked at the vast, empty landscape surrounding them, miles from town, miles from anyone who might come to his aid. For the first time since his arrival, Victor Crane looked afraid. $700, he said finally, his voice no longer so confident. "That was your offer." Colton nodded. "It was." "Make it 800 and we have a deal." 750, final offer. A long moment passed. Then Crane nodded, his face tight with barely suppressed rage. "Done." Colton turned to Thomas. "Fetch the strongbox from my study, $750 in gold." Thomas hurried away, returning moments later with a heavy wooden box. Colton counted out the money while Crane watched, his eyes glittering with greed. When the last coin was counted, Crane signed over the debts and handed the papers to Colton. "A pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Hayes," Crane said, though his voice was anything but pleasant. "Leave my property," Colton replied. "And do not ever come back." Crane climbed back into his carriage, his hired men mounting their horses. As the carriage began to roll away, he leaned out the window and called back, "You may have won this battle, Hayes, but I never forget a slight. Never." Colton watched until the carriage disappeared over the horizon. Then he turned and walked toward the house, where Clara was waiting on the porch, tears streaming down her face. "Is it over?" she asked. "It is over." She flew into his arms, and he held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beat against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "You never have to thank me," he said. "Not for protecting what is mine." Clara pulled back to look at him, her green eyes shining. "Am I yours, then?" "If you will have me." "I already said yes, remember, until death and beyond." Colton smiled, and it was a real smile, a full smile, the kind that reached his eyes and chased away the shadows. "Then let us go inside, Mrs. Hayes. We have a future to build." Winter came to Hawk Ridge Ranch with a vengeance. Snow piled high against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing. But inside, it was warm, filled with laughter and love, and the smell of Mrs. Holloway's cooking. Clara had never been happier. She woke each morning in her husband's arms, went to sleep each night listening to the steady beat of his heart. The nightmares that had plagued her since childhood faded, replaced by dreams of green pastures and blue skies, and a future brighter than anything she had dared to imagine. Colton, too, was transformed. The darkness that had haunted his eyes for 7 years began to lift. He smiled more, laughed more, talked more. The men who worked for him noticed the change and remarked on it among themselves. The boss was like a different man, they said. Like the man he had been before his wife died. Maybe even better. On Christmas Eve, they sat together by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. Outside, the snow was falling gently, covering the world in a blanket of white. Inside, the tree that the men had cut down and Clara had decorated sparkled with candles and ribbons and the few ornaments that Mrs. Holloway had saved from years past. "I have something for you," Colton said, reaching into his pocket. Clara smiled. "We said no gifts." I lied. He pulled out a small velvet box and handed it to her. Inside was a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a pendant shaped like a hawk in flight. Tiny gems sparkled in its eyes, catching the firelight. "Colton," Clara breathed. "It is beautiful. It belonged to my mother. My father gave it to her on their wedding day. She wore it every day until she died. I have been waiting for someone worthy of it ever since." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes as he fastened the necklace around her throat. The pendant settled against her skin, warm from his hands. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Clara felt the last of her walls crumble. She had spent her whole life protecting herself, building defenses against a world that had only ever hurt her. But here, in this man's arms, in this house that had become her home, she finally felt safe enough to let them fall. "I have something for you too," she said when the kiss ended. "I thought we said no gifts." I lied too. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, her eyes shining with joy and a hint of nervousness. Colton stared at her, confusion giving way to understanding. Understanding giving way to something that looked almost like fear. "Clara, are you saying—" "Yes." She smiled through her tears. "We are going to have a baby, Colton, sometime in the summer, if my calculations are correct." For a long moment, he did not move, did not speak, did not breathe. Clara felt a flutter of worry in her chest. She knew his history, knew what had happened the last time, knew the fear he must be feeling. Then he dropped to his knees before her, his hands cupping her face, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. In answer, Colton pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his face buried in her hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When he finally pulled back, his face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. Smiling like she had never seen him smile before. "Happy is not a big enough word," he said. "Clara, you have given me everything, everything I thought I had lost forever. A home, a family, a reason to wake up in the morning. You have given me back my life." Clara kissed him, tasting salt and love and the promise of a future they would build together. "You gave me my life first," she reminded him. $3, remember?" Colton laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the room. $3 was the best investment I ever made. They sat together by the fire until the candles burned low and the snow piled higher against the windows. They talked about the future, about names for the baby, about rooms that would need to be prepared and furniture that would need to be bought. They talked about their hopes and their fears and their dreams. And when they finally climbed the stairs to their bedroom, hand in hand, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Spring came slowly to the mountains, creeping in on tentative feet, testing the resolve of the snow that still clung to the highest peaks. The days grew longer, the nights grew warmer, and Clara's belly grew round with the life inside her. She was sitting on the porch one afternoon, watching the men work in the corral, when she saw the rider coming up the road. Her heart gave a little leap of fear before she recognized the horse. It was one of their own, one of the ranch hands returning from town. The rider dismounted and hurried toward her, a letter in his hand. "For you, Mrs. Hayes," he said, tipping his hat. "Came all the way from Philadelphia." Clara thanked him and waited until he was gone before opening the envelope with trembling hands. She did not recognize the handwriting, but the return address made her catch her breath. It was from a law firm. The same law firm that had sent the letter about Victor Crane. She read the letter twice, unable to believe what it said. Then she read it a third time, and a sound escaped her that was half laugh, half sob. When Colton returned from the range that evening, Clara met him at the door, the letter clutched in her hand. "What is it?" he asked, his face immediately concerned. "Is it the baby? Are you all right?" "I am fine. We are fine." She thrust the letter at him. "Read this." He read it, his eyes widening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at her in disbelief. "Is this real?" Apparently. Clara could not stop smiling. "Victor Crane is dead. Heart failure, they say, and in his will he left instructions that all debts be forgiven and all previous claims relinquished. His lawyer says it was some sort of deathbed repentance. He wanted to make amends for his sins before he faced his maker. The money I paid him is being returned, in full, along with a letter of apology from his estate." Colton let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. "Then it is truly over, all of it." "All of it," Clara agreed. He swept her into his arms, careful of her swollen belly, and held her tight. "You are free," he whispered into her hair. "You are finally truly free." "I was free the moment you paid $3 for me," she said. "Everything since then has just been extra." He laughed, that deep, rumbling laugh she loved so much, and kissed her soundly. The baby came in early August, on a night when the moon hung full and bright over the mountains. Clara's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Colton thought he might lose her, might lose them both, and the terror of those moments would stay with him for the rest of his life. But Mrs. Holloway was there, steady and competent, talking Clara through every contraction, never letting her give up. And when the final push came, when the baby's cry split the air like a trumpet announcing the dawn, Colton felt tears streaming down his face. "A boy," Mrs. Holloway announced, her own eyes wet. "A healthy, beautiful boy." She placed the baby in Clara's arms, and Clara looked down at him with an expression of wonder that Colton would never forget. The baby had his mother's copper hair and his father's grey eyes, and he was perfect, absolutely perfect. "What will we name him?" Clara asked, her voice hoarse from screaming. Colton sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around his wife, one finger gently stroking his son's cheek. "What do you think of Daniel?" he said. "After my father." Clara smiled. "Daniel Hayes, I like it." "Daniel Thomas Hayes," Colton amended, glancing at the door where Thomas Holloway stood, trying unsuccessfully to hide his emotion. "After the man who has been like a father to me." Thomas turned away, but not before Clara saw the tears on his weathered cheeks. "Daniel Thomas Hayes," she repeated, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead. "Welcome to the world, little one. You are already so loved." The years that followed were good ones, hard at times, as ranch life always was, but good. Daniel grew into a strong, healthy boy with his mother's spirit and his father's quiet strength. He was followed 2 years later by a sister named Rose. the name Colton had chosen so long ago for a daughter who never drew breath. This rose was vibrant and alive, with copper curls and a laugh that could be heard across the valley. Hawk Ridge Ranch prospered. The cattle multiplied, the land expanded, and Colton's reputation as a fair and honest man spread throughout the territory. He became a pillar of the community, someone people turned to for advice and assistance. Clara stood beside him through it all, his partner in every sense of the word. Mrs. Holloway and Thomas eventually retired to a small cottage on the edge of the property, where they spent their days spoiling their adopted grandchildren and reminiscing about the old times. New hands came and went, but the ones who stayed became like family. And through it all, the love between Colton and Clara only grew stronger. It was on their 10th wedding anniversary that Colton told her he had a surprise. He led her out to the pasture where they had first kissed on that long-ago night when she had asked him to stop being honorable. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. "Of course I remember." Clara smiled up at him, her green eyes still as bright as the day he had first seen them. "This is where you kissed me for the first time. Properly kissed me, I mean. It is also where I realized I was going to marry you. You proposed in your study. I had decided long before that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I had this made for you, for today." Clara opened the box and gasped. Inside was a ring, a band of gold set with a single emerald, the exact color of her eyes. "Colton, the $3 I paid for you was the beginning of everything," he said. "I know I proposed in the study. I know we married in the parlor, but I wanted to ask you again, here, in this place where I first knew what you meant to me." He dropped to one knee before her, and Clara screamed. It was not a scream of fear or pain or anger. It was a scream of pure, overwhelming joy, a scream that echoed across the mountains and sent birds flying from the trees, a scream that she would be embarrassed about later, when she told the story to her children and grandchildren. But in that moment, she did not care. "Clara Hayes," Colton said, grinning up at her, "will you do me the honor of continuing to be my wife for the rest of our days?" "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, you ridiculous man, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger next to the gold band she had worn for 10 years and rose to his feet. His arms came around her, lifting her off the ground, and he spun her around until she was dizzy with laughter. "I love you," he said, setting her down but not letting her go. "I love you too." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar she had come to love as much as any other part of him. "I have loved you since the moment you stepped forward in that crowd. Since you paid $3 to set me free." $3, Colton repeated, shaking his head. "Best money I ever spent." "I should certainly hope so." He kissed her then, deep and long and full of promise, and Clara felt the same fireworks she had felt that first night in his study, the same joy, the same certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Behind them, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Before them, the house waited, warm and welcoming, full of the sounds of children playing and the smell of supper cooking. And between them, there was love. The kind of love that survives hardship and tragedy, the kind of love that grows stronger with each passing year, the kind of love that, once found, never fades. $3 had bought her freedom, but love, true love, had given her everything else. And as Colton took her hand and led her home, Clara knew that she was the richest woman in the world. The end of their story was really just the beginning. In the years to come, there would be more challenges, more triumphs, more moments of heartache and joy. Daniel would grow up to be a rancher like his father, taking over Hawk Ridge when Colton finally decided to slow down. Rose would marry a schoolteacher from town and fill her parents' house with a parade of grandchildren who were spoiled within an inch of their lives. Colton's hair went completely silver, and Clara's developed streaks of white that she refused to hide. They grew old together, these two people who had found each other against all odds. They grew old and they grew happy, and they never once forgot how precious their love was. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Clara looked at her husband across the crowded room and smiled. He was 84 years old, stooped and wrinkled, but his eyes were still storm-grey and full of love when they met hers. He made his way to her side and took her hand, his fingers gnarled but warm. 50 years, he said. 50 years, she agreed, and it has not been nearly enough. Then let us make it 50 more. Clara laughed. That same bright laugh that had captivated him so long ago. I'm not sure either of us will make it that long. Then we will make the most of whatever time we have. He leaned down and kissed her gently, reverently, and Clara heard their grandchildren groaning and their great-grandchildren giggling. "Get a room," Daniel called from across the parlor, his own hair now silver, his own grandchildren climbing on his knees. "We have a room," Colton called back. "Several, in fact. It is our house, after all." The room erupted in laughter, and Clara leaned into her husband's side, feeling his arm come around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For everything. For that day in Silver Creek. For $3. For 50 years of love and laughter and life." Colton tightened his arm around her and pressed a kiss to the top of her silver-streaked head. "Thank you for saying yes," he replied. "For screaming yes, actually, if memory serves." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, even after all these years. "I did not scream. You most certainly did. The birds in the trees flew away in terror. Well, you surprised me. I hope I always surprise you." "You do." She looked up at him, her green eyes softer now, but still bright with love. Every single day. They stood together in the midst of their family. These two people who had started as strangers, a giant cowboy with a scarred face and a wounded heart, a young woman with nothing but her name and her courage. They had found each other across the chaos of an auction block, had built a life from $3 and a leap of faith. And they had never looked back. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Inside, the house was full of warmth and love and the sound of generations gathered together. It was, Clara thought, a perfect ending, or rather a perfect continuation of a story that would never really end. Because love like theirs, love that is built on sacrifice and nurtured by trust, love that survives every storm and emerges stronger on the other side, does not die when the people who share it pass from this world. It lives on, in the children they raised, in the ranch they built, in the countless lives they touched throughout their long, full years. And somewhere out there, perhaps, in another time and another place, another lonely cowboy is watching another scared young woman standing on an auction block. And he is reaching into his pocket, and he is stepping forward. Because that is what love does. It shows up. It pays the price, and it never, ever lets go. Clara smiled as she looked around the room one more time, at the family she and Colton had created. Then she looked up at her husband, her partner, her best friend, and she said the words she had said to him 1,000 times before. "I love you, Colton Hayes." And he replied, as he always did, "I love you too, Clara Hayes. Until my dying breath and beyond. Until death and beyond." That was the promise they had made all those years ago. And it was a promise they kept. Always and forever. The end.